Hey 8th graders, and welcome to today's Explainer. Have you ever stopped to think about how one single decision can literally change the entire world? It's a pretty wild thought, right? When we look back at history, especially during massive conflicts like the American Civil War, the choices made by military generals didn't just decide who won a battle on some random Tuesday. No, they directly decided the fate of entire nations. The strategies they chose shaped the very country we live in today. So in this Explainer, we are going to explore exactly that in Commanding Tactics, the strategies of Grant and Lee.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Proverbs 21:5 offers a seriously powerful piece of wisdom. The plans of the diligent lead to profit, as surely as haste leads to poverty. And honestly, this scripture perfectly sets up our whole lesson today. It reminds us that careful, deliberate strategy matters immensely. In war, you can't just rush in blazing with haste and expect a victory. You've got to be diligent. You absolutely need a plan. And today, we are going to look at two brilliant men who had very, very different plans.
So here is our roadmap for today. First, two generals, one big war. Second, Grant's war of attrition. Third, Lee's bold battlefield maneuvers. Fourth, the clash of strategies. And finally, education, morality, and peace.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1. Two generals, one big war, and a look at how military choices shape history.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive difference between our two leaders. You see, studying Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee helps us understand exactly why the Union won and the Confederacy lost. Both of these men were brilliant in their own unique ways, but their situations, worlds apart. Grant commanded a very well-supplied Union army, backed by giant factories, miles of railroads, and just immense manpower. Lee, on the other hand, led a severely resource-strapped Confederate force. The South simply didn't have the same industry or troop numbers. And as you'll see, the resources you have, or, the ones you don't have, completely dictate the kind of strategy you have to use.
Moving right along to Section 2, Grant's War of Attrition. This is all about the strategy of relentless offense.
So, stepping into the blue corner, Grant wasn't just looking to win a few scattered skirmishes. He was aiming for total war. The absolute core of his strategy was a war of attrition. What does that mean? Basically, wearing down the enemy through constant, unending pressure, even if it means taking really heavy casualties on your own side. It sounds incredibly harsh, doesn't it? Well, it is. It wasn't about outsmarting the enemy with some fancy battlefield trick. It was about outlasting them. Kind of like a heavy, grinding wheel just slowly wearing down a piece of metal.
Now I want you to pause and think critically for a second. Why push forward despite high casualties? If losing soldiers is a terrible thing, what on earth is the logic behind a strategy that essentially guarantees heavy losses?
Well, it honestly comes down to cold, hard math. Grant knew the numbers inside and out. The Union could replace its lost soldiers and supplies way more easily than the Confederacy ever could. Grant realized that by just keeping the pressure dialed all the way up, he could force the South into an unwinnable situation based purely on resources. He wasn't just fighting Lee's men, he was fighting the South's fundamental ability to wage war at all.
So how did this actually play out on the ground? Well, first, he applied constant pressure, literally no breaks, no letting the enemy rest. Second, in 1864, he launched the Overland Campaign. This was a massive series of battles where he just kept coming. Third, this brutal campaign systematically pushed Lee's army back, step by step, toward the Confederate capital of Richmond. And fourth, because Lee couldn't replace his staggering losses, this relentless push forced the eventual surrender of the Confederate army. Grant's plan was incredibly diligent, and yeah, it worked.
Okay, jumping into Section 3, Lee's bold battlefield maneuvers. It's all about speed, surprise, and the defense of the South.
Let's shift our focus over to the gray corner. Imagine you're Lee. How do you fight back when you're heavily outmatched in men and supplies? Well, you get creative. Since he absolutely couldn't win a grinding war of attrition, Lee focused on defending the South by relying heavily on speed and rapid movement. He used the element of surprise to keep the massive Union army totally off balance. Instead of hitting them head-on with brute force, he would completely outmaneuver them. And this tactical brilliance led to some genuinely stunning early victories for the Confederacy, like the famous Battle of Chancellorsville, where he totally shocked a much larger Union force.
But Lee also knew that just playing defense wouldn't win the war forever. Eventually, he took a massive, massive gamble. In 1863, he left the defensive position and actually invaded northern soil. So pose this question to yourself. Why would a general with fewer men and way fewer supplies risk going deep into enemy territory?
The answer is all about politics and survival.
Lee desperately needed a decisive, undeniable victory on northern soil. He hoped this would do two major things. First, that it would pressure a very wary Union into negotiating peace, and second, that it might actually win the Confederacy's support from European countries who were watching the whole thing from across the ocean. He needed a knockout punch, but, as history shows us, this massive gamble resulted in the disastrous defeat at Gettysburg. It ended that hope entirely and deeply crushed Confederate morale.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this all builds, the clash of strategies, and how the tide of war turned.
If we lay this out on a timeline, in the early part of the war, Lee's strategy of speed and surprise was working flawlessly. He secured those brilliant victories like at Chancellorsville. But then comes 1863. Lee rolls the dice, invades the North, and suffers that disastrous defeat at Gettysburg. This right here was the dramatic turning point of the entire conflict. After Gettysburg, Lee's forces were permanently forced onto the defensive. Then, by 1864, Grant takes charge and launches his relentless overland campaign. Lee can no longer use his rapid movement to win. He is effectively trapped in Grant's war of attrition.
Putting these two titans head-to-head is just fascinating. On one side, Grant emphasized sustained offense and overwhelming force. On the other, Lee relied on rapid movement and surprise. Both of these men left massive marks on military history, and both of their styles had very real strengths. But ultimately, Grant's persistence and his specific strategy perfectly matched the huge geographical and political advantages the Union already had. He played the hand he was dealt with incredible effectiveness.
All right, to really lock this history into your memory, I want you to test yourself on these 5 key questions. Can you explain Grant's war of attrition? What exactly was Lee hoping to gain by invading the North? What was Grant's absolute biggest advantage? How did their army strengths actually compare? And finally, think critically on this one. Whose strategy was ultimately more effective and why? Take your time and chew on those.
And finally, Section 5, Education, Morality, and Peace, a quick look at the HeroesMart Academy philosophy.
So, stepping away from the battlefield for a second, the really crucial point we want to leave you with today is this. Education without morality will hurt. We spent this whole time talking about brilliant tactical maneuvers and incredibly smart strategies, but you know what? If we only ever focus on being smart, we completely miss the most important piece of the puzzle.
Seriously, I want to challenge you with this profound question. What is the actual point of being super smart and supposedly educated if you just continue to make bad choices that hurt yourself and the people around you? Think about it. You could be the most brilliant tactician in the world, but if your choices lack a moral compass, they are eventually going to lead to destruction. True education has to be intertwined with biblical morality. That is how we make sure our knowledge is used to build things up rather than tear them down.
And that brings us perfectly to Romans 8:6-7, which promises peace of mind to everyone who keeps their minds spiritual. When we intertwine our education with morality, when we really focus on making choices that are diligent and good, the result is genuine peace. So as you go about your week, ask yourself, are you just gathering facts to look smart, or are you actually building the moral compass required to change the world for the better? Keep your mind spiritual, stay diligent, and I'll see you in our next explainer.